Abigail came to Thomas's funeral with her coat buttoned over the small curve of her stomach. She only wanted to see him one last time. But Claudette was already standing at the entrance to St. Andrew's, and the moment she saw Abigail crossing the parking lot, she moved to block the door. "Don't you dare." Claudette's voice cut across the cold November air. "After everything you put him through, you have the audacity to come here." Abigail stopped walking. Around her, a few people turned to look. She knew most of them: Thomas's colleagues, his cousins, the neighbors from the house on Aberdeen Avenue, where he had grown up. She had met them at birthday dinners and Christmas gatherings, always introduced as Thomas's girlfriend, then as his wife. Now she stood outside the church where she had planned to marry him properly in the spring, with her sister as maid of honor and his best friend beside him. "I just want to say goodbye," Abigail said. Her voice stayed even. "That's all I'm asking." Claudette stepped fully in front of the door. She was 61 years old and dressed in the kind of black that cost money. Fine wool coat, pearl earrings, the polished composure of a woman who had never been told no in her own home. "You don't belong here. You never belonged in my son's life." Abigail looked past her toward the open door, toward the flowers in the casket, and the last place Thomas would ever be. She placed one hand against her stomach without meaning to. Claudette's eyes dropped to that hand. "I'm pregnant," Abigail said quietly. "This is Thomas's baby. That's something you should know." Claudette's expression did not change. "How would I know whose baby that is?" The words landed hard enough that Abigail felt them in her chest. She stood there for a moment, unable to find an answer to something so deliberately cruel. Behind Claudette, two of Thomas's uncles appeared and moved toward them, not to help Abigail but to keep Claudette from crossing the last few feet between them. "Leave," Claudette said. "Take your story and go. That child is not my concern." Abigail remained where she was long enough to hear the organ music begin inside. Then she walked back to her car, sat in the driver's seat and pressed both hands flat against the steering wheel until the shaking stopped. She did not know it then, but the words Claudette had said, on the steps of that church, would be the words she would spend the rest of her life regretting. Because the child she had just refused to acknowledge was the only piece of her son still left in the world. Thomas Mercer had grown up in Hamilton's West End, in a house that smelled like fresh paint and old money. His mother had widowed young, inheriting enough from Thomas's father to keep the house on Aberdeen Avenue, pay for private school, and maintain the particular kind of pride that comes with having just enough to look down on people who have less. Abigail had grown up in Guelph in a house that smelled like her mother Agnes's cooking, garlic and butter and whatever was on sale at the co-op. Her father had driven a delivery truck until his knees gave out. She had put herself through nursing school on a combination of student loans and weekend shifts at a coffee shop near the university, and she had been quietly proud of that, the way you are proud of something you worked for entirely on your own. She and Thomas had met at Hamilton General, where he worked in hospital administration, and she was halfway through her second year on the cardiac unit. He had come to her floor to deal with a scheduling dispute and stayed 20 minutes longer than he needed to, asking her questions about patient care that she later understood were mostly an excuse to keep talking to her. He asked her to dinner 3 days later. She said yes. Claudette had disapproved from the moment Thomas mentioned Abigail's name. It was not anything she said directly at first. It came through in questions. Where does she come from? What is her family situation? Has she had any serious relationships before? What exactly are her plans for her career? The questions were polite on the surface and quietly brutal underneath, and Thomas understood what she was really asking. He had grown up watching her apply this same careful filter to everyone who came near him. When he brought Abigail to the house on Aberdeen for dinner for the first time, Claudette had been pleasant in the way that people are pleasant when they have already decided something and want you to feel the distance without being able to name it. She complimented Abigail's earrings. She did not refill her glass. Driving home that night, Thomas had reached across the center console and taken Abigail's hand. "She'll come around," he said. Abigail looked out at the highway. "She doesn't have to." "She will, she just needs time." Abigail had believed him, because Thomas was the kind of person who believed things like that. He thought people were basically trying their best and would find their way to decency eventually if you were patient enough. It was one of the things she loved about him and one of the things that quietly frustrated her, because she had grown up understanding that some people would not come around, that patience was not always the answer, and that waiting for someone else's approval was a way of letting them hold power over your life. But she had tried. She had come to Claudette's house for Sunday dinners. She had brought flowers. She had asked about the photographs on the walls and listened to the stories and said the right things at the right times. Claudette had never been outright unkind in those moments, but the warmth was always just slightly out of reach, like a door left open an inch. The real conversation came 6 months after Thomas and Abigail moved in together. Claudette had arrived at their apartment without calling ahead. She rarely called ahead, and found Abigail at the kitchen table in a nursing uniform, eating a bowl of cereal before a night shift. "I'd like to speak with you privately," Claudette said, in the voice she used when she had already decided how a conversation would go. Thomas was in the shower. By the time he came out, Claudette had told Abigail that she was not the right person for her son, that Thomas had a certain future ahead of him, that a nurse from Guelph with student debt and no family connections would only slow him down, and that the kindest thing Abigail could do for him was step aside before things became more complicated. Abigail had listened to all of it without interrupting. When Claudette finished, she set down her spoon and said, "I'll let Thomas know you stopped by." Thomas had been furious in the quiet way he got furious, very still, very deliberate. He called his mother that same evening. They argued for almost an hour. When he came back to the kitchen where Abigail was getting ready for work, he held her face in his hands. "You don't have to prove anything to her," he said. "Not ever. Are we clear on that?" She had nodded. "I mean it, Abby. If she can't see what I see, that is her problem, not yours." They moved to a new apartment after that, somewhere Claudette didn't have a key to. Thomas still visited his mother on Sundays when Abigail was on shift, and Abigail did not ask him to choose, because she understood that whatever his mother was, she was still his mother. She only asked that their home be a place Claudette came to by invitation. It was in that apartment, on a Tuesday evening in October, that Abigail took a pregnancy test and stared at the result for a long time before going out to the living room where Thomas was watching the news. She placed the test on the cushion beside him without saying anything. He looked at it, then at her, then back at it. "Is this?" "Yes." Thomas stood up and crossed the room and lifted her off the floor, which he had never done before, and which she told him later had genuinely startled her. He held her there for a moment, laughing a little, and then put her down and pressed his forehead against hers. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she said. "We're going to need a bigger place." "I know. And I should probably tell my mother." She held his arm. "Give it a few days." He smiled. "Okay, a few days." He never got the chance. 3 weeks later, on a Wednesday evening in November, Thomas left his office at the hospital to pick Abigail up after her shift because a freezing rain warning had come in, and he did not want her taking the bus in that weather. He texted her when he left. He never arrived at the hospital entrance where she was waiting. The police found his car on the overpass near the waterfront. The ice had done what ice does when it comes without warning. A transport truck coming from the other direction had not been able to stop in time. Abigail heard the sound of the hospital's sliding doors opening and closing behind her for a long time after, standing on the curb in the cold, before she understood that he was not coming. In the weeks that followed the funeral, Abigail went through the motions of being alive without feeling particularly connected to any of them. She ate because the baby needed her to eat. She slept in fits. She went back to work after 10 days because staying in the apartment alone was worse than being at the hospital. And at the hospital, there were people who needed things from her, which gave her somewhere to put her attention. Her mother Agnes came up from Guelph for 2 weeks and slept on the pull-out sofa and made soup and did not say very much, which was exactly right. Agnes was a small, practical woman who understood that grief could not be argued with, only sat beside. 3 weeks after the funeral, Claudette called. Abigail almost didn't answer. She had not heard from Claudette since the steps of St. Andrew's, and she had assumed, had hoped, that Claudette's silence meant she had decided to leave her alone. "I've been thinking about the baby," Claudette said, without saying hello, without saying she was sorry, without acknowledging the church steps at all. "I want to be involved. When the child is born, I want to be part of the arrangements." Abigail stood in her kitchen and looked out the window at the gray Hamilton sky. "You told me at Thomas's funeral that you didn't know whose baby this was." "I was grieving." "So was I." "Abigail." Claudette's voice shifted into something more careful. "I am still this child's grandmother, regardless of anything that was said. Thomas would have wanted you to treat me with basic respect, Abigail said. I have to go. She ended the call and sat down at the kitchen table and put her head in her arms. The calls continued after that. Claudette never raised her voice. She never apologized. She shifted around the subject of the baby the way you shift around something you want without wanting to be seen wanting it. She talked about family legacy. She talked about what she could provide. The house on Aberdeen, the connections, the stability. As though Abigail were a variable to be removed from an equation rather than the child's mother. Then, one afternoon in January, Claudette came to the apartment. Abigail opened the door. Claudette stepped inside as though she had done it 100 times, which she had not. She sat down on the couch, looked around the apartment, and placed a folded piece of paper on the coffee table. A certified check, she said, $120,000. Abigail looked at it without touching it. I know this situation isn't easy for you, Claudette continued. You're a single person with a nursing salary and student debt, and you are about to have a baby on your own. This money would allow you to start fresh somewhere. Pay off what you owe. Find a different situation for yourself. She paused. When the child is born, I would take over care from there. The baby would grow up in the house on Aberdeen. Thomas's child deserves that. Abigail looked at the check for a long time. Then she looked up at Claudette. Thomas's child also has a mother, she said. Abigail, I'm not going to sell you my baby. She picked up the check and held it out. Take this back. Claudette did not take it. She looked at Abigail the way she had always looked at her, with that careful, measuring patience, the kind that is really just contempt with its jacket on. Think about what you're saying. Think about what you can actually give this child compared to what I can. I'm thinking about it right now. Abigail stood. The answer is no, I'd like you to leave. But the pressure did not stop. A few days later, a man Abigail did not recognize came to her building and asked the woman at the front desk questions about her schedule. The front desk worker, a retired teacher named Sylvie who had taken a liking to Abigail, turned him away and called up to warn her. After that, Abigail began receiving texts from unfamiliar numbers. Short messages. You should consider what's being offered. This doesn't have to be complicated. Think about the baby's future. She started saving every single one. She screenshotted them with timestamps. She sent copies to her email, to a folder on her laptop, to a USB drive she kept in her jacket pocket. She was a nurse. She understood documentation. Her colleague at the hospital, a man named Desmond, who worked in physiotherapy and had once spent 40 minutes helping her fix a scheduling error that wasn't even his problem, noticed that she had started walking to her car with her keys already out and checking over her shoulder in the parking garage. You okay? He asked one Thursday after their shifts aligned in the elevator. Not really, she said. He had bought her a coffee from the machine in the break room and listened while she told him everything. Desmond was 34 and had been raising his daughter, Poppy, by himself since she was 14 months old, after his marriage had ended in the particular way that leaves you rethinking everything you thought you knew about yourself. He was not easily shocked by what people were capable of, and he was not the kind of person who offered opinions you had not asked for. Keep everything, he said. Every message, every call log, every name. If she escalates, you want a paper trail. I've been keeping it. Good. He looked at her over the lid of the coffee cup. And if anything else happens, call me first. 3 days later, Abigail came out of a prenatal appointment to find a woman she didn't know standing beside her car in the parking lot, holding a manila envelope. The woman said Claudette had retained a solicitor and that the envelope contained preliminary documents for a family court application regarding the guardianship of an unborn child. Abigail thanked the woman for her time. Then she drove directly to a legal aid clinic near James Street and sat down with a family law paralegal named Christine. She spread everything she had been collecting across the desk, the screenshots, the call logs, the dated notes, the name of the man who had come to her building, the description Sylvie had given her. Christine looked through it all for a long time. She's building a case around resources, she said. She'll argue that as a single mother on a nursing salary, you cannot provide the same opportunities as the grandmother. That's a strategy, not an automatic win for her side. What does my side look like? Your side looks like a mother with documented income, stable housing, a healthcare profession, and extensive records of harassment by the opposing party. Christine tapped the folder. Keep collecting. And speak with a full family lawyer as soon as you can. Because if she files, you want to be well ahead of it. That evening, Abigail called Agnes in Guelph and told her everything. Agnes was quiet for a long time. "Come home," she said. "I can't just leave my job, Mom." "I know. I'm not saying forever. I'm saying come home until you figure out what comes next." What came next, as it turned out, was a different city entirely. Desmond had mentioned Halifax once, that his older sister lived there, that Halifax Health Authority was almost always hiring nurses, that it was far enough away to make things harder for Claudette without leaving the country. He said it casually, not as advice but as information, and left it there. Abigail thought about it for a week. She called a nursing recruiter in Halifax on a Thursday before her shift. By Friday, she had a phone interview. By the following Wednesday, she had a conditional offer. She sat with that information for 2 days before she said anything to anyone. When she told Desmond, he looked relieved in a way that suggested he had been quietly worried about her for some time. When she told Agnes, Agnes cried for a few minutes and then said, "Good, go, call me every day." She gave 3 weeks' notice. She did not tell Claudette she was leaving. She changed her phone number, deactivated her social media, and gave her new contact information only to Agnes, to Desmond, to her sister in Waterloo, and to Christine at the legal clinic, with instructions to forward anything from Claudette's lawyers to the Halifax firm she had already engaged. When the Halifax firm wrote back to Claudette's solicitor with Abigail's formal response to the guardianship application, which outlined the harassment, the surveillance, the unsolicited visits, the texts from unknown numbers, and the check that had been placed on Abigail's coffee table like a transaction waiting to be settled, it took Claudette's lawyer 2 full weeks to respond. The response was a settlement offer. Abigail's Halifax lawyer recommended she decline. She did. Halifax in February was cold in a different way than Hamilton. The cold came off the harbor with a kind of directness that Abigail found, unexpectedly, that she did not mind. She had rented a furnished 1-bedroom in the North End, 3 blocks from a bakery that opened at 6 in the morning, which suited her shift schedule. Her new colleagues at the hospital were careful with her, in the way that people are careful with someone who has recently been through something hard. But they did not make her talk about it, which she appreciated. She still had Thomas's jacket. It had been hanging on the hook behind the bedroom door when she packed, and she had folded it into her bag without thinking about it too deliberately, because thinking about it too deliberately would have made it impossible to bring herself to do it. On the nights, when the flat upstairs was quiet and the harbor sounds came through the window, she sometimes spoke to him in the dark. Not dramatically. Just the ordinary things she would have told him over dinner, how her shift had gone. Something strange Poppy had said in a voiced message Desmond forwarded, what she was planning to name the baby. Desmond texted every few days. Nothing demanding, a weather complaint from Hamilton, a photo of something Poppy had made at school. Poppy had decided, he reported, that she was going to visit the baby as soon as the baby was old enough to appreciate being visited. Abigail wrote back, "Tell her the baby will be ready." The baby was ready in April. She had arranged for a doula, a woman named Carol, who had attended over 400 births, and who said very little during the hard parts, and exactly the right things during the pauses. Agnes had driven up from Guelph the night before, and sat in the corner of the delivery room, and held Abigail's hand whenever Carol did not need it. She named him Finn. The name came from a conversation she and Thomas had in October, about a week after they found out about the pregnancy. They had been lying on the couch arguing, in the affectionate way of people who know each other well, about what name would suit a boy. Thomas had said, without much deliberation, that he had always liked Finn. Clean, he said. No ambiguity. You always knew exactly where you stood with a Finn. Abigail had laughed and told him it sounded like the name of a golden retriever. Thomas had said that was precisely the energy he was going for. She had said, if it's a boy, we'll think about it. It was a boy. His name was Finn. Back in Hamilton, in the house on Aberdeen Avenue, Claudette received the documents from Abigail's Halifax lawyer. She read them alone in the front sitting room, the same room where she kept Thomas's school photographs, and a framed portrait of him at 23 that had been taken the summer he came back from working abroad. Abigail had not only responded to the custody application, she had filed a counter-application that cited the documented harassment campaign, the surveillance, the intimidation, the check, and requested that the court formally recognize Claudette's conduct in the period following Thomas's death. The Halifax lawyer had done this without drama. laying out each incident in the flat, factual language that family court prefers. Claudette's solicitor advised her very quietly that pursuing the guardianship application further was unlikely to succeed and would result in a public record that neither of them would find comfortable. Claudette sat with that advice for several days. The sitting room was very quiet in the evenings now. There had been a time when Thomas would come on Sunday afternoons, and she would make him lunch, and they would argue pleasantly about the Blue Jays, and she would send him home with containers of food he said he didn't need, and always took anyway. The house had been arranged around those visits. Without them, she was not always certain what it was arranged around. Her friend Elspeth, who had known Claudette since the children were small, and who had watched the whole business with Abigail unfold, with the patient silence of someone who knows a person well enough to see their mistakes before they do, came by one evening in May. She sat across from Claudette with her tea and said, after a long pause, "Do you remember what you told me about Thomas's father's family, when he died and they came to the house?" Claudette looked at her. "They told you that you had trapped him," Elspeth said, "that you had married into that family for what you could get, that his death was somehow connected to the unhappiness you brought into the marriage." She set her cup down. "You were 32 years old and you had just buried your husband, and they said those things to you at his wake. You told me you never forgot how that felt." Claudette said nothing. "That girl came to the church carrying his baby," Elspeth said. "And you did the same thing to her that they did to you." The room was very quiet after that. Outside, the street was beginning to go dark, the last of a late spring evening draining out of the sky. Claudette sat with her hands in her lap and looked at Thomas's photograph on the wall. She did not reach Abigail that night. She had no number for her. She had no address. She did not know which hospital Abigail worked at, or what street she lived on, or whether the baby had already been born. She had spent months trying to find out all of those things, and Abigail had, with quiet and deliberate care, made sure she couldn't. Claudette sat alone in the house on Aberdeen Avenue and understood, for the first time, that the silence around her was something she had built herself, one decision at a time, long before Thomas ever died. Finn was 4 years old when Abigail brought him to the Halifax Seaport Farmers Market on a Saturday morning in September. He had recently become interested in the stalls that sold model boats, and Abigail had made the mistake of buying him one the previous month, which had produced a specific and inconvenient enthusiasm for the entire category. He was standing in front of a craft stall, crouching down to look at the lower shelf, when Abigail caught up to him. "Finn, we talked about this." "Mom, look." He picked up a small knitted item, a winter hat, child-sized, deep cornflower blue, the exact shade of the sky over the harbor on a clear day, and held it out to her with the certainty of a child who has already made up his mind. "For you." Abigail took it from him. "You want to buy me a hat?" "It's the right color." He said this as though it explained everything, because to him it did. "You said Dad used to call it cornflower blue, and you still have the scarf in the closet, the one he gave you." She had told him that story once, almost in passing, about the cornflower blue scarf Thomas had bought her their first winter together, because he said it was exactly the color of her eyes in certain light, which she had told him was completely ridiculous, which he had agreed with and bought the scarf anyway. She had not realized Finn had held on to that detail. She should have known. He kept everything. "You want to buy me a blue hat," she said. "It matches the scarf," he said. "Dad would think that's funny." Abigail looked at her son standing in the morning light with his coat half buttoned and one lace working loose on his left boot, entirely sure of himself, entirely certain that this was a good idea, and that the reasons for it were obvious. She bought the hat. She was wearing it when they walked back out into the September morning, Finn's hand in hers, the harbor visible at the end of the block. Desmond had texted the night before to say that he and Poppy were making the drive down for Thanksgiving, that Poppy had made Finn a card with a drawing of the two of them and had refused to mail it because she insisted drawings had to be delivered in person. Abigail had written back that they would be home. They walked through the market together, Finn stopping at every stall that interested him, which was most of them. Abigail let him take his time. The road that had brought her here had not been short or easy or kind at every step. She had grieved Thomas more than she could have imagined, and in ways she was still sometimes learning the shape of. She had been told she was not enough, and she had refused to believe it, and the refusal had cost her things she would not pretend away. But here was the harbor, and here was the morning, And here was her son telling her that his father would think the hat was funny. Finn stopped walking and looked up at her. Can we get hot chocolate? Where do you think you're getting hot chocolate? At 9 in the morning. He pointed at a cart 10 meters ahead with complete confidence. She laughed. 1, and you finish it before we leave. He was already pulling her forward by the hand, the way children do when they are entirely certain that what comes next will be good.